Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we journey into the ancient realm of Egyptian mythology, where gods walked among mortals along the banks of the Nile, where death was but a doorway to eternity, and where the sun died each night only to be reborn each dawn. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Settle beneath whatever stars shine over you tonight, and let us begin. In the beginning, there was none, the primordial waters of chaos that existed before creation itself. This was not merely water as we understand it, but the infinite, undifferentiated potential from which all things would emerge. It was neither light nor dark, neither hot nor cold, but simply the eternal possibility of being. From these waters would rise the first land, the first light, the first consciousness that would speak the world into existence. From none arose the primeval mound, the first solid ground to emerge from the cosmic waters. Upon this mound stood Adam, whose name means the complete one, the first god to achieve self-awareness in the void. Adam was both male and female, containing within himself all possibilities, all potential forms of life and consciousness. He was the sunrise and the sunset, the beginning and the end, the one who would create through the power of his word and his will. But Adam was alone, and loneliness was not suitable for one destined to create a cosmos filled with life and movement. Through his own divine essence, he brought forth the first pair of gods. Some say he sneezed them into existence, others that he wept them into being, but the most common telling speaks of a more intimate act of creation. Adam took his divine seed and from it fashioned Shu, god of air and wind, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture and rain. Shu was the breath of life itself, the wind that would carry the scent of flowers across the desert, the air that would fill the lungs of every living creature. His presence brought movement to the stillness, carried sounds across vast distances, and lifted birds into the sky. Where Shu passed, stagnation ended and life began to stir. Tefnut was the moisture that made life possible in a land dominated by desert. She was the morning dew on lotus petals, the life-giving flood of the Nile, the tears of joy shed by mothers holding newborn children. Without her gift of water, the harsh sun would have scorched all life from the earth before it could take root. But as young gods often do, Shu and Tefnut wandered far from their father, exploring the vast expanse of the primordial waters, discovering the boundaries of existence. They traveled so far into the darkness beyond creation that they became lost, unable to find their way back to the mound where Adam waited. The first god wept for his lost children, and his tears, falling into none, became the first human beings, creatures of divine sorrow and longing, destined to search throughout their lives for connection with the sacred. To find his children, Adam removed his eye and sent it out into the chaos to search for them. This eye, which would later be known as the Eye of Ra, possessed its own consciousness and power. It flew through the dark waters, seeking the lost gods, and when it found them, it guided them home to their father. But while the eye was gone, Adam had grown a new eye to replace it. When the original eye returned and saw that it had been replaced, it wept with rage and hurt. To console his faithful eye, Adam placed it upon his forehead, where it became the uraeus, the cobra that would crown all future pharaohs. This eye became both protector and destroyer, watching over those who served Ma'at, the cosmic order, and striking down those who threatened the balance of creation. It was the first symbol of divine authority, the emblem that would mark the chosen rulers of Egypt throughout all the dynasties to come. Shu and Tefnut, reunited with their father, embraced each other with the passion of lovers as well as siblings. From their union came Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. But their love was so intense, their embrace so complete, that they could not separate. Geb lay upon his back while Nut arched over him, her body forming the dome of the heavens, her fingers and toes touching the four horizons. They were locked in eternal embrace, leaving no space between earth and sky for life to flourish. Seeing this, Adam commanded his son Shu to separate the lovers. With great effort, Shu placed himself between earth and sky, lifting Nut high above Geb, creating the space where air could move, where clouds could form, where birds could fly and humans could build their civilizations. Yet even separated, the love between Geb and Nut remained strong. Each dawn, Nut would swallow the sun god Ra as he completed his daily journey across her body, and each night she would give birth to him again, ensuring that light would always return to the world. The separation of earth and sky created the physical framework of the world, but it also established one of the fundamental patterns of Egyptian mythology: the cycle of separation and reunion, death and rebirth, descent into darkness and return to light. This pattern would echo through every aspect of Egyptian religion, from the daily journey of the sun to the ultimate destiny of human souls. With the world now properly structured, creation could begin in earnest. Nut, despite being separated from her beloved Geb, was already pregnant with 5 children who would become some of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon. But Ra, the sun god who had emerged from the union of Adam with his own creative power, decreed that Nut could not give birth on any day of the year. This seemed an impossible curse, for how could she birth her children if no day was available to her? But Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, found a solution through cleverness and gambling. He challenged Khonsu, the moon god, to a game of Senet, the ancient Egyptian board game beloved by gods and mortals alike. The stakes were portions of moonlight itself, small fragments of time that Khonsu would forfeit if he lost. Thoth's wisdom proved superior to the moon god's fortune, and he won enough moonlight to create 5 additional days beyond the normal year. These were the epigomenal days, the days upon the year, when normal time was suspended and anything might happen. On these 5 days, Nut gave birth to her divine children, each destined to play a crucial role in the cosmic drama that would unfold across the ages. On the first day came Osiris, who would become the god of the underworld and judge of the dead. Even as a newborn, he radiated the calm authority of one destined to rule, and a voice from the heavens proclaimed him the Lord of all creation. On the second day came Horus the elder, god of the sky and kingship, whose eyes would become the sun and moon. The third day brought Set, god of chaos, storms, and the desert, whose jealousy and ambition would drive much of Egyptian mythology's central drama. The fourth day saw the birth of Isis, who would become the greatest of all goddesses, the ideal wife and mother, the mistress of magic who could speak the secret names of gods and bend reality to her will. On the fifth and final day came Nephthys, goddess of mourning and the boundaries between life and death, who would serve as protector of the dead and faithful sister to Isis in all her trials. These 5 siblings would form the core of the Egyptian divine family, their relationships and conflicts echoing the experiences of mortal families while operating on a cosmic scale. Their stories would become the foundation myths that explained everything from the flooding of the Nile to the authority of the pharaohs, from the rituals of mummification to the hope of resurrection after death. But even as these gods came into being, the framework of creation was still being established. Ra, the sun god, had emerged as the supreme deity, traveling across the sky each day in his solar bark, bringing light and life to the world. His journey was not merely physical but spiritual. For each night he would die and travel through the Duat, the underworld, facing demons and obstacles before being reborn at dawn. This daily death and resurrection of the sun became the model for understanding all existence. Nothing was permanent except change itself, but change followed patterns, and those patterns gave meaning to both joy and suffering. The sun's nightly journey through darkness promised that no matter how deep the night, dawn would always come. As Ra established his reign over the cosmos, he created other gods to assist in maintaining the order of creation. From his tears came humanity, beings capable of both great beauty and terrible destruction, blessed with consciousness but burdened with mortality. From his laughter came the lesser gods who would serve as intermediaries between the divine realm and the world of mortals. He created Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, whose feather would weigh the hearts of the dead to determine their worthiness for eternal life. Ma'at was not merely a deity but a principle, the fundamental law that governed how things should be. She was present in every act of justice, every moment of honesty, every effort to maintain balance and harmony in a world that constantly threatened to slip back into chaos. To Ma'at, he gave the responsibility of maintaining the cosmic order, ensuring that the sun rose each day, that the Nile flooded each year, that the seasons followed their proper sequence. But he also made her fragile, vulnerable to the actions of both gods and mortals. When truth was spoken, Ma'at grew stronger. When lies were told, when justice was perverted, when chaos was chosen over order, she weakened, and the entire cosmos suffered. This made every moral choice a cosmic act. The peasant who shared his bread with a hungry stranger strengthened the very foundations of reality. The official who took bribes and perverted justice brought the universe closer to collapse. The pharaoh who ruled with wisdom and compassion ensured that the sun would continue to rise and the Nile would continue to flood. With the basic structure of reality established and the principles of order defined, the stage was set for the great drama that would define Egyptian mythology for millennia. It was a drama of love and betrayal, of death and resurrection, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos. At its center stood the divine family of Geb and Nut's children, whose conflicts and reconciliations would shape the destiny of both gods and mortals. The Golden Age began when Osiris, eldest and wisest of the 5 siblings, assumed rulership over the world. This was not a conquest but a natural assumption of authority, for Osiris embodied all the virtues that made civilization possible. He was just without being harsh, strong without being cruel, wise without being distant. Under his reign, humans learned agriculture, law, and the arts of civilization. Osiris took Isis as his wife, and their marriage became the model for all unions, a partnership of equals, each bringing their own gifts to create something greater than either could achieve alone. Isis was not merely a consort but a co-ruler, her magic and wisdom complementing Osiris's natural authority. Together they transformed the world from a place of survival into a realm of abundance and beauty. Meanwhile, Set married Nephthys, but their union lacked the harmony that blessed Osiris and Isis. Set was drawn to chaos and conflict, while Nephthys yearned for the peace and stability her sisters had found. The marriage was troubled from the beginning, a union of convenience rather than love, political necessity rather than genuine affection. The tension between the two couples reflected the fundamental duality that ran through all Egyptian thought, the constant struggle between order and chaos, creation and destruction, life and death. These were not simply opposing forces but complementary aspects of reality, each necessary for the world to function properly. But balance was delicate, and when it was lost, catastrophe followed. Set's jealousy of his brother grew slowly, like poison seeping through the foundations of a great building. He watched as mortals praised Osiris's wisdom, as gods deferred to his judgment, as even Ra himself spoke approvingly of the younger god's reign. What Set could not understand was that Osiris's authority came not from force or cunning but from service, the willingness to bear the burden of responsibility for the welfare of all creation. The breaking point came during a great feast celebrating the anniversary of Osiris's coronation. Set had prepared a beautiful chest, made of the finest cedar and inlaid with gold and precious stones. He announced that he would give this treasure to whoever could fit inside it perfectly. Many gods tried, but the chest had been crafted specifically for Osiris's measurements. When he lay down inside it, Set slammed the lid shut and sealed it with molten lead. The chest became a coffin, and Set cast it into the Nile, sending his brother floating downstream toward the delta and the sea beyond. The murder of Osiris sent shockwaves through the cosmic order. The sun dimmed, the Nile ran backward, and chaos began to creep into the spaces where order had once held firm. The Golden Age was over, and the age of struggle had begun. But death, in Egyptian mythology, was not the end of the story but the beginning of transformation. As the chest containing Osiris's body floated down the Nile and out into the Mediterranean, it carried within it not just the remains of a murdered god, but the seed of a new kind of existence, one that would bridge the gap between life and death, between the mortal and the eternal. The chest washed ashore at Byblos, where a great tree grew around it, encasing the body of Osiris in its trunk. The tree grew to enormous size, and its beauty was so remarkable that the local king ordered it cut down and made into a pillar for his palace. Unknown to him, his palace now held the body of a god, and strange phenomena began to manifest around it. Sweet fragrances filled the air, flowers bloomed out of season, and the sick were healed by merely approaching the pillar. Meanwhile, Isis had begun her search for her husband's body. Her grief was so profound that it stopped the flooding of the Nile and brought drought to Egypt. She cut off her hair in mourning, tore her clothes, and wandered the length of the kingdom seeking any trace of Osiris. Her search was aided by the fact that she knew the secret names of all things, knowledge that gave her power over gods and mortals alike. Through her magic, Isis learned of the pillar at Byblos and traveled there in disguise. Taking the form of a humble nursemaid, she won employment in the royal palace and became caretaker to the infant prince. Each night, when the palace slept, she would place the child in a fire of transformation, burning away his mortality so that he might become immortal. But she was discovered in this act by the queen, who screamed in terror at seeing her child in flames. Revealed in her true form, Isis explained who she was and why she had come. The king and queen, awed by the presence of the goddess and grateful for the gift she had tried to give their son, granted her request. The pillar was cut open, revealing the chest within, and Isis took possession of her husband's remains. But her trials were far from over. As she transported Osiris's body back to Egypt, she was forced to hide in the delta marshes to avoid Set's agents who sought to reclaim their victim. There, in the hidden places among the reeds, she used her magic to temporarily restore life to Osiris. In that brief moment of resurrection, they conceived a son, Horus, who would grow up to avenge his father and claim his rightful throne. Set discovered what had happened and flew into a rage that shook the heavens. Finding Osiris's body, he tore it into 14 pieces and scattered them across Egypt, hoping to prevent any possibility of resurrection. Each piece fell in a different location, and where they landed, great temples would later be built, making all of Egypt sacred to the memory of the murdered god. Once again, Isis began her search, this time aided by her sister Nephthys, who had finally broken with Set over his increasingly cruel actions. Together, the two goddesses scoured the land, finding 13 of the 14 pieces. The 14th piece, Osiris's phallus, had been eaten by fish and could not be recovered. But Isis's magic was equal to this challenge. She crafted a new phallus from gold and wax, and through her spells, made it more potent than the original. Using the most powerful magic ever attempted, Isis reassembled her husband's body and wrapped it in linen bandages infused with preservative spells. She became the first mummifier, establishing the ritual that would ensure eternal life for all who followed the proper procedures. With the help of Anubis, the jackal-headed god who had emerged from her union with Osiris during their brief resurrection, she performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, restoring to the dead god all his faculties. But Osiris could not return to rule the living world. His death had transformed him into something new, the first being to conquer death while remaining dead, to achieve eternal life while accepting the reality of mortality. He became the lord of the underworld, the judge who would weigh the hearts of the dead against the feather of Ma'at, the God who offered the promise of resurrection to all who lived according to the principles of truth and justice. The death and resurrection of Osiris established the pattern that would govern Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife for thousands of years. Death was not an ending but a transformation, a difficult journey that could lead to eternal life for those who were properly prepared. The mummification process, the spells inscribed in tombs, the grave goods buried with the dead. All of these were based on the understanding that consciousness could survive the death of the body if the proper procedures were followed. Meanwhile, young Horus grew to manhood hidden in the Delta marshes, protected by his mother's magic and trained in the arts of war and kingship. He knew from childhood that his destiny was to avenge his father and reclaim the throne that Set had usurped. But he also knew that victory would require more than strength. It would demand wisdom, patience, and the ability to inspire others to follow him into battle against a god who commanded the forces of chaos itself. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine whether order or chaos would rule the world, whether justice would triumph over might, whether the promise of resurrection that Osiris represented would be preserved or destroyed forever. It was a struggle that would span decades and involve not just the immediate family of gods, but the entire pantheon, as every deity was forced to choose sides in the ultimate battle for the soul of Egypt. But that battle lay in the future. For now, there was mourning for what had been lost, preparation for what was to come, and the slow, careful work of keeping hope alive in a world where darkness seemed to have gained the upper hand. The golden age of Osiris's reign had ended, but the promise of a new golden age, one that would include both gods and mortals in its blessings, was being forged in the hidden places of the Delta, where a young god learned what it meant to be both human and divine, both vulnerable and powerful, both the son of the murdered god and the future king of Egypt. The war between Horus and Set began not with armies clashing on a battlefield, but with legal arguments in the court of the gods. For though Set had murdered Osiris and usurped his throne, he claimed that his actions were justified, that Osiris had grown weak and complacent, that strong leadership required the willingness to make harsh decisions, that chaos was sometimes necessary to clear away old structures so that new ones could grow. The divine tribunal that assembled to hear the case was led by Ra himself, now ancient beyond measure, weary from his daily journey through the heavens and his nightly battle against the forces of entropy in the underworld. Around him sat the great gods of Egypt: Ta, the creator god of Memphis; Thoth, the wise judge who recorded all deeds; Neith, the ancient war goddess whose words carried the authority of primordial law. For 80 years the case dragged on, each side presenting arguments, calling witnesses, appealing to precedent and principle. Horus argued that he was the rightful heir, that Set's actions had been murder and usurpation, that order must be restored according to Ma'at. Set countered that strength was the only true law, that Horus was too young and inexperienced to rule, that the world needed a king who understood the necessity of decisive action. The gods were divided. Some supported Horus out of sympathy for his cause and respect for his father's memory. Others favored Set, believing that his harsh methods were better suited to maintaining order in a world where chaos constantly threatened to break free. Still others remained neutral, waiting to see which claimant would prove more worthy through their actions rather than their arguments. As the legal proceedings dragged on, both gods sought to prove their worthiness through contests and trials. They competed in feats of strength, displays of magic, tests of wisdom and leadership. Each contest seemed to favor one claimant or the other, but none was decisive enough to end the dispute. The very indecisiveness of these trials reflected the fundamental tension in Egyptian thought between the ideals of justice and the realities of power. One of the most famous contests involved a race using boats made of stone. Set, confident in his raw power, carved his vessel from a mountaintop, creating a craft that was massive and intimidating. Horus, guided by his mother's wisdom, built his boat to look like stone while actually constructing it from wood covered with painted plaster. When the race began, Set's boat sank immediately under its own weight, while Horus's clever deception allowed him to win easily. But Set was not content to lose gracefully. In his rage, he transformed into a hippopotamus and attacked Horus's boat from beneath the water. The ensuing battle was fierce, with Horus wielding his harpoon against Set's massive jaws and crushing weight. The fight raged across the Nile and into the marshes beyond, destroying islands and changing the course of the river itself. During this battle, Isis attempted to help her son by casting a spell that would bind Set with ropes of magic. But in the fury of combat, her spell went astray and struck Horus instead. Seeing his mother's mistake, whether accidental or motivated by some deeper sympathy for Set, who was still her brother, Horus cut off her head in his rage. Immediately repenting of this act, he fled into the desert to grieve for his terrible deed. Thoth, the wise god of healing, found Isis's severed head and restored it to her body, but replaced her human head with that of a cow, marking her transformation into Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and motherhood. This transformation was both punishment and blessing. Punishment for her moment of weakness, blessing because it allowed her to become an even more powerful force for nurturing and protection. The contests continued, growing ever more violent and destructive. In one trial, both gods transformed into hippopotamuses and fought beneath the waters of the Nile for 3 months. Their battle so intense that it caused earthquakes and floods throughout Egypt. In another, they competed as bulls, their clashing horns creating thunder that could be heard from Memphis to Aswan. Perhaps the most disturbing contest involved Set's attempt to rape Horus during the night, seeking to establish dominance through sexual conquest. But Horus was warned by Isis and caught Set's seed in his hands, then threw it into the river. In revenge, Horus spread his own seed on lettuce leaves that Set unknowingly consumed. When the gods called upon the seed to identify its location, Set's seed called out from the river while Horus's seed called out from within Set's body, establishing Horus's dominance in this most intimate of contests. These contests revealed the dark undercurrents of the conflict, the ways in which disputes over power could corrupt even the most noble intentions, turning heroes into monsters and transforming sacred principles into weapons of destruction. The war between Horus and Set was not simply a battle between good and evil, but a complex struggle involving pride, trauma, family loyalty, and the fundamental question of what kind of authority was legitimate in a world where both order and chaos were necessary forces. As the years passed, the ongoing conflict began to take its toll on Egypt itself. Without a clear ruler, the cosmic order grew unstable. The Nile's floods became unpredictable, sometimes devastating the land with too much water, other times leaving the fields dry and barren. Storms raged out of season. The stars wandered from their appointed paths, and mortals suffered from the uncertainty that plagued the divine realm. It was this suffering of innocence that finally moved the court of gods to seek a resolution. Osiris himself, speaking from his throne in the underworld, reminded the assembly that the purpose of divine rule was not to glorify the rulers but to serve those who depended on them. The dead god's words carried special weight, for he had experienced both the glory of absolute power and the humility of complete defeat, and his perspective transcended the partisan concerns that had prolonged the conflict. Neith, the ancient goddess whose authority predated even Ra's, proposed a final solution. Horus would be recognized as the legitimate pharaoh of the living, inheriting his father's authority over the civilized world. But Set would not be punished or humiliated. Instead, he would be given dominion over the desert, the storms, and the foreign lands beyond Egypt's borders. His strength and ferocity would serve as protection against the enemies that threatened the kingdom from without. This division satisfied the requirements of Ma'at while acknowledging the realities of power. Horus's victory was not the complete triumph of good over evil, but the establishment of a balance that allowed both order and chaos to serve the greater good. Set's exile was not eternal punishment but recognition that his nature, while destructive when turned against Egypt, could be protective when directed against Egypt's enemies. The resolution of the Horus-Set conflict established the divine prototype for pharaonic rule that would govern Egypt for 3 millennia. Every pharaoh was understood to be the living incarnation of Horus, wielding divine authority on earth. Upon death, the pharaoh would become Osiris, joining the company of the blessed dead, while his heir would assume the mantle of the living god. But the mythology also acknowledged the Set aspect of rulership. The necessity for pharaohs to be capable of violence when violence was needed, to make hard decisions that might seem cruel but were necessary for the kingdom's survival, to embody the principle that sometimes order could only be maintained through the controlled application of chaotic force. This complex understanding of power, neither purely benevolent nor simply tyrannical, but a careful balance of opposing forces, reflected the sophisticated political thought of ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was divine, but divinity itself was understood to contain contradictions, to require wisdom in navigating between competing demands, to demand sacrifice from rulers as well as subjects. With the succession settled, Egypt entered a new age of stability and prosperity. Horus ruled with the wisdom he had gained from his long struggle, the compassion he had inherited from his parents, and the strength he had developed through years of conflict. His reign became the model against which all future pharaohs would be measured, the golden standard of just and effective governance. But the mythology did not end with Horus's victory. Instead, it expanded to encompass the full complexity of Egyptian religious thought, incorporating hundreds of deities, thousands of stories, and sophisticated theological concepts that would influence human spiritual development for millennia. The basic framework established by the Osiris myth became the foundation for understanding everything from the daily rising of the sun to the ultimate destiny of human consciousness after death. The Ennead of Heliopolis, the 9 great gods descended from Adam, became the core of Egyptian religious thought, but around them gathered a vast pantheon of deities representing every aspect of existence. There were gods of individual cities and regions, goddesses of specific crafts and professions, deities who governed particular animals or natural phenomena, divine beings who embodied abstract concepts like wisdom, justice, and beauty. Each of these gods had their own stories, their own relationships with the central figures of Egyptian mythology, their own roles in maintaining the cosmic order. Together they formed a complex web of divine relationships that mirrored and informed the social, political, and spiritual life of ancient Egypt. To understand Egyptian mythology fully would require not just the central narrative of Osiris and Horus, but the thousands of smaller stories that surrounded and supported that central tale. Yet at its heart, Egyptian mythology remained focused on the fundamental questions that had driven the original creation story. How should order be maintained in the face of chaos? How should power be exercised in service of justice? How can consciousness survive the dissolution of the body? How can love triumph over death? The answers Egyptian mythology provided to these questions were neither simple nor absolute. They required constant interpretation, continual adaptation to new circumstances, and the wisdom to understand that truth often resided not in choosing between opposites, but in finding the balance that allowed both sides of a paradox to serve the greater good. This sophisticated understanding of complexity and balance would be the lasting legacy of Egyptian religious thought, influencing not only the cultures that succeeded ancient Egypt, but also the development of human spiritual consciousness itself. In the myths of Isis and Osiris, of Horus and Set, of Ra's daily journey through the underworld, humanity found some of its earliest and most profound explorations of what it means to be conscious in a universe that encompasses both creation and destruction, both love and loss, both time and eternity. The golden age of Horus's reign brought peace to Egypt, but it also brought new challenges and responsibilities. With Set banished to the desert and the succession finally settled, the focus of divine activity shifted from conflict to creation, from warfare to the more subtle arts of governing a complex civilization. This required new kinds of gods and new kinds of stories, tales not of battle and conquest but of wisdom and craftsmanship, healing and justice, love and artistic creation. Ptah, the god of Memphis, emerged as one of the most important figures of this new era. Unlike the gods of Heliopolis, who had been born from the primordial waters, Ptah was said to have created himself through the power of thought and speech. He represented a more sophisticated understanding of creation, not as a physical process of generation and birth, but as an intellectual and artistic act of conception and expression. According to the theologians of Memphis, Ptah had conceived the entire cosmos in his heart and brought it into being by speaking its name. This was creation as an act of will and imagination rather than biological necessity. Ptah became the patron of craftsmen and artists, of all who shaped raw materials into objects of beauty and utility, of all who participated in the ongoing work of creation. In the workshops of Memphis, skilled artisans would invoke Ptah's blessing as they carved statues, crafted jewelry, built temples, and created the magnificent objects that would fill the tombs of pharaohs and nobles. They understood their work as a form of divine service, a way of participating in the cosmic process of bringing order out of chaos, beauty out of raw material, meaning out of mere existence. But Ptah was also the god of justice in a very practical sense. In his role as patron of craftsmen, he ensured that work was properly rewarded, that skills were fairly taught and learned, that the products of labor served their intended purposes. He represented the divine principle that honest work deserved honest payment, that mastery should be respected and shared, that the fruits of human creativity belong to all humanity rather than just to their immediate creators. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, played an equally important role in the new dispensation. As the scribe of the gods and the recorder of Ma'at, he was responsible for maintaining the cosmic bookkeeping that kept the universe running smoothly. Every deed was recorded in his ledgers, every word weighed and measured, every thought evaluated according to its contribution to order or chaos. But Thoth was more than just a divine accountant. He was the inventor of writing itself, the gift that allowed humans to record their thoughts and experiences, to communicate across time and distance, to preserve knowledge for future generations. In Egyptian thought, writing was not merely a practical tool but a form of magic, the power to make thoughts permanent, to give weight and substance to ideas, to create reality through the manipulation of symbols. The scribes who served in temples and government offices understood their work as a sacred calling. They were the keepers of Ma'at in its written form, responsible for ensuring that laws were recorded accurately, that contracts were fair, that the wisdom of the past was preserved for the future. Through their careful copying of texts, their meticulous attention to detail, their dedication to accuracy and clarity, they participated in Thoth's divine mission of maintaining truth and order. Thoth also served as the divine physician, the god who could heal both physical ailments and spiritual disorders. His medical knowledge was based not on empirical observation alone, but on a deep understanding of the connections between body and soul, between individual health and cosmic harmony. Disease was understood as a form of chaos that had invaded the ordered system of the body, and healing required not just physical treatment but spiritual realignment with the principles of Ma'at. The medicine practiced in ancient Egypt was remarkably sophisticated, combining careful observation of symptoms with surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and spiritual interventions. Doctors were trained not just in anatomy and drug preparation, but in the recitation of healing spells, the performance of purification rituals, and the recognition of spiritual causes for physical ailments. This holistic approach to healing reflected the Egyptian understanding that humans were complex beings composed of multiple interconnected elements: the physical body, the spiritual Ka that animated it, the Ba that contained personality and consciousness, the Ak that represented the perfected soul capable of existing in the afterlife. True healing required attention to all these aspects of human nature, not just the most obvious physical symptoms. Batet, the cat goddess of Bubastis, represented yet another aspect of the divine feminine that had emerged from the complex theological developments of the New Kingdom. Originally a lioness goddess associated with the fierce protective power of the sun, she had evolved into a more domesticated deity who embodied the gentle, nurturing aspects of feline nature. Cats were sacred to Batet because they embodied the qualities she represented: independence combined with affection, fierce protection of their offspring, the ability to move between the world of the living and the realm of spirits that humans could not perceive. In Egyptian homes, cats were not merely pets but representatives of the divine, living symbols of Bastet's protective presence. The worship of Batet reflected the Egyptian appreciation for the sacred in the everyday, the understanding that divinity was not confined to temples and formal rituals, but could be encountered in the most ordinary circumstances of daily life. A cat sleeping in a sunny window, a mother nursing her kittens, a feline hunter stalking prey through the grain storehouse. All of these were epiphanies of the goddess, moments when the divine presence became visible in the mundane world. During the annual festival of Batet, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims would travel to Bubastis to participate in celebrations that combined religious devotion with joyous celebration. The festival was famous throughout the ancient world for its combination of sacred ritual and uninhibited revelry, its acknowledgement that the divine could be encountered through pleasure and happiness, as well as through solemn ceremony and austere discipline. As Egyptian mythology matured and became more sophisticated, it began to grapple with increasingly complex questions about the nature of existence and consciousness. The simple stories of the early creation myths gave way to elaborate theological treatises that explored the relationships between different aspects of divinity, the mechanisms by which divine will was translated into physical reality, and the ultimate destiny of consciousness in a universe governed by both order and chaos. One of the most important developments was the concept of the Ka, the life force that animated all living beings but could survive the death of the physical body. The Ka was not simply a soul in the Western sense, but something more complex. A spiritual double that contained all the essential characteristics that made an individual unique, yet was also connected to the divine source from which all life emerged. Understanding the Ka required recognizing that Egyptian thought did not draw sharp distinctions between the physical and spiritual realms. The Ka existed simultaneously in both worlds, manifesting in the physical body during life but capable of independent existence after death. This dual nature meant that the Ka needed both spiritual nourishment in the form of prayers and offerings, and physical sustenance in the form of food and drink placed in tombs. The preservation of the Ka after death became one of the central concerns of Egyptian religion. The elaborate mummification process was designed not just to preserve the body as a recognizable form, but to create a suitable dwelling place for the Ka in the afterlife. The tomb was not merely a storage place for a corpse, but a house for the continuing existence of the deceased, complete with all the amenities needed for eternal life. This concern with the afterlife was not morbid obsession with death, but its opposite. A passionate belief in the continuity of consciousness, a refusal to accept that death was the end of existence, a commitment to creating the conditions under which love and memory could transcend the physical limitations of mortal life. The elaborate tomb preparations, the detailed funeral texts, the careful preservation of the body. All of these were acts of hope, expressions of faith that consciousness was stronger than dissolution. The journey through the afterlife was understood to be both perilous and transformative. The deceased had to navigate the dangers of the Duat, the underworld realm where Osiris held court and the dead were judged. This journey was guided by the spells and instructions contained in funerary texts. First, the pyramid texts reserved for pharaohs, later the coffin texts available to nobles, and finally the Book of the Dead that could be purchased by anyone with sufficient resources. These texts were not simply collections of magic spells, but sophisticated guides to consciousness transformation. They described in detail the geography of the afterlife, the challenges that would be encountered there, the passwords and formulas needed to pass through various gates and barriers. But they also provided instructions for the fundamental transformation of identity that death required, the shift from being a living person identified with a particular body and social role to being a blessed spirit capable of existing in multiple forms and locations simultaneously. The climax of the afterlife journey was the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at in the court of Osiris. This was not simply a moral judgment but a test of fundamental identity. Whether the deceased had lived in accordance with the cosmic order, whether their heart had been shaped by truth and justice, whether they had become the kind of being capable of existing in harmony with the divine realm. Those who passed this test joined the company of the blessed dead, becoming spirits capable of interceding for the living, traveling freely between the earthly and divine realms, participating in the daily journey of RA through the heavens and the underworld. They became part of the cosmic community that maintained the order of creation, no longer limited by the constraints of individual mortality but not dissolved into an undifferentiated divine unity either. But the mythology also acknowledged that not all would achieve this blessed state. Those whose hearts were heavy with evil would be devoured by Ammit, the crocodile-headed monster who consumed the unworthy dead. This was not eternal punishment in the sense of later religious traditions, but rather a second and final death, the complete dissolution of consciousness back into the chaos from which it had originally emerged. This understanding of posthumous judgment reflected the Egyptian conviction that moral choices had cosmic significance, that individual actions contributed to the maintenance or destruction of the universal order, that consciousness carried with it an inescapable responsibility for its own development and for the welfare of the larger community of which it was part. The mythology of the afterlife was not separate from the concerns of daily life but intimately connected to them. The promise of eternal life was conditional on living according to Ma'at in this world, treating others with justice and compassion, speaking truth even when it was costly, maintaining the obligations of family and community, contributing to the common good rather than pursuing only personal advantage. This created a religious culture that was both deeply spiritual and intensely practical, both focused on transcendent goals and committed to improving conditions in the immediate world. The pharaoh who built temples and maintained justice was preparing not only for his own eternal life but for the welfare of his people in this life. The scribe who recorded transactions honestly, the farmer who shared his surplus with the hungry, the mother who raised her children with love and wisdom, all were participating in the divine work of creation and earning their place among the blessed dead. As the centuries passed and Egypt encountered other cultures through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, the mythology continued to evolve and adapt. Foreign gods were incorporated into the pantheon, their stories woven into the existing narrative structure, their worship adapted to Egyptian religious practices. This was not syncretism for its own sake, but a recognition that divine truth might manifest in different forms among different peoples, that the Egyptian gods were part of a larger cosmic order that transcended national boundaries. The worship of Isis, in particular, spread far beyond Egypt's borders, carried by merchants, soldiers, and slaves to every corner of the Mediterranean world and beyond. Her story of love surviving death, of wisdom triumphing over violence, of motherhood as a divine force spoke to universal human experiences that transcended cultural differences. In her various manifestations, as the mourning widow, the protective mother, the wise magician, the queen of heaven. She became a goddess for all peoples, all conditions, all needs. But even as Egyptian religion spread throughout the ancient world, it faced new challenges from emerging religious and philosophical traditions that offered different answers to the eternal questions about the nature of existence and the purpose of consciousness. Greek philosophy, with its emphasis on rational inquiry and abstract thought, challenged the mythological approach to understanding reality. Judaism, with its commitment to monotheism and ethical monotheism, questioned the polytheistic framework that had sustained Egyptian religion for millennia. Most significantly, Christianity emerged from the cultural matrix of the Hellenistic world with a message that seemed to fulfill many of the promises that Egyptian religion had made while transcending its limitations. The story of Jesus, a God who died and was resurrected, who offered eternal life to all who believed, who embodied perfect love and perfect justice, resonated powerfully with people raised on the mythology of Isis and Osiris. The conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity marked the beginning of the end for the ancient Egyptian religion as a living tradition. Temples were closed, statues destroyed, priests persecuted or converted. The hieroglyphic writing system that had preserved the sacred texts for thousands of years was forgotten, and with it much of the detailed knowledge that had sustained the complex mythology. Yet the influence of Egyptian religious thought did not disappear entirely. Many of its central insights, the belief in life after death, the understanding that moral choices have cosmic significance, the vision of existence as a journey towards spiritual transformation, were incorporated into the emerging Christian tradition. The iconography of Isis nursing the infant Horus influenced depictions of the Madonna and Child. The concept of divine kingship that had sustained pharaonic rule contributed to the development of Christian theories of sacred monarchy. More subtly, the Egyptian understanding of the relationship between order and chaos, between creation and destruction, between time and eternity, influenced the development of Western esoteric traditions that would preserve and transmit ancient wisdom through the dark ages that followed the fall of the classical world. The mythology lived on in another form as well, in the magnificent monuments that the pharaohs had built to ensure their eternal life. The pyramids of Giza, the temples of Luxor and Karnak, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were not merely archaeological curiosities, but embodied prayers, physical manifestations of the spiritual aspirations that had driven Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia. When Napoleon's expedition opened Egypt to European exploration in the late 18th century, and when Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphs in the early 19th, the ancient mythology began to live again in the imagination of the modern world. Scholars, artists, and spiritual seekers found in Egyptian religion a depth and sophistication that challenged contemporary assumptions about the development of human consciousness. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 captured the world's attention and brought Egyptian mythology into popular culture in ways that continue to influence art, literature, and spirituality today. The image of the golden pharaoh, surrounded by the magnificent objects that would serve him in the afterlife, embodied the Egyptian promise that death was not the end, but the beginning of a new and more glorious form of existence. In our contemporary world, Egyptian mythology continues to speak to fundamental human concerns about mortality, meaning, and transcendence. The story of Isis and Osiris resonates with anyone who has experienced the death of a loved one and wondered whether love could survive the grave. The concept of Ma'at offers a vision of cosmic justice that transcends the imperfect justice of human institutions. The promise of the afterlife provides hope that consciousness is more than a temporary arrangement of matter, that individual existence has significance beyond its brief appearance in the physical world. But perhaps most importantly, Egyptian mythology offers a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between order and chaos, between creation and destruction, that remains relevant to contemporary challenges. The ancient Egyptians understood that civilization was fragile, that it required constant effort to maintain, that the forces of entropy and dissolution were always pressing against the boundaries of organized existence. Yet they also understood that chaos was not simply the enemy of order but also its source and renewal. The annual flood of the Nile, which brought both destruction and fertility, was the perfect symbol of this paradox. Chaos that served the purposes of creation, destruction that made new life possible. This understanding suggests that the modern world's tendency to see order and chaos as simple opposites may be inadequate for addressing the complex challenges we face. Climate change, technological disruption, social transformation, all of these involve the kind of creative destruction that the ancient Egyptians understood as necessary for the continuation of life. The mythology suggests that wisdom lies not in trying to prevent all change or to control all outcomes, but in learning to work with the fundamental forces of creation and destruction, to find ways of maintaining what is valuable while allowing what is no longer viable to pass away, to participate consciously in the eternal process of death and rebirth that governs both individual lives and the evolution of consciousness itself. In the end, Egyptian mythology offers what all great religious traditions offer. Not easy answers to life's difficult questions, but better ways of thinking about those questions, richer frameworks for understanding human experience, deeper appreciation for the mystery and wonder of existence. The gods of Egypt may no longer receive offerings in their temples, but their stories continue to illuminate the human condition, continue to offer guidance for the eternal journey from birth through death toward whatever lies beyond. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. In continuing to tell their stories, to ponder their wisdom, to find relevance in their insights, we participate in that resurrection. The gods of Egypt live on not in stone temples but in human consciousness, not in ancient rituals but in contemporary understanding, not as objects of worship but as sources of wisdom for the continuing adventure of being human in a universe that remains as mysterious and wonderful as it was when Ra first emerged from the waters of Nun to begin the long work of creation. And so the story ends where it began, with the recognition that endings are also beginnings, that death serves life, that chaos feeds creation, that consciousness continues its eternal journey toward greater understanding, greater compassion, greater wisdom. The sun sets on the ancient land of Egypt, but it rises on new horizons, carrying within its golden light the eternal truths that the children of the Nile discovered in their long communion with the sacred mysteries of existence. Good night.